What would you do if standing up for what was right meant standing alone against an entire town? Most people never face that moment, not truly. They imagine it, late at night, when the world is quiet, and the version of themselves they picture is braver and cleaner than the one that shows up in the actual morning. But there are those rare souls, worn by the sun, calloused by hard work, and tempered by something deeper than pride, who don't even hesitate when the moment arrives. Not because they aren't afraid, but because fear, for men like this, has never been a good enough reason to step aside. This is the story of one of those men, and the choice he made in the dust of the Arizona territory didn't just cost him everything he had spent years building. It revealed everything he truly was beneath it. His name was Eli Cord. Not a famous man, not a lawman or a general or an outlaw whose name would be carved into the legend of the frontier. Just a rancher. A man who had come west with little more than a pair of strong hands, a stubborn will, and a dream of land that belonged to him alone. Land he could work, land he could pass on, land that no one could take because it was bought and paid for with his own sweat and years. By the spring of 1883, that dream had taken shape in the form of 300 acres of dry, beautiful rangeland just south of the Gila River in the Arizona territory. He had built every fence post himself, driving each one into the hard caliche earth with the kind of deliberate patience that defines men who build things meant to last. He had dug the well by hand over the course of 3 weeks one summer, going down 22 feet before water came. He had built the house in stages, adding a room each year as his finances allowed, so that the structure grew the way a life grows, not all at once, but in honest increments. He had buried a wife there too, in the red earth beneath a juniper tree at the north corner of the property. Her name had been Ruth, and she had died of fever in the 3rd winter, before the well was finished, before the 2nd room was built, before the dream had become anything more than a determination. She had left him a daughter, Elena, and an absence so complete it had its own shape in every room of the house. Eli had raised Elena alone since, and had done it the way he did everything, without complaint, without asking for recognition, with a consistency that was its own form of devotion. By the spring of 1883, Elena was 16, sharp as new wire, and the only person on earth for whom Eli Cord would have admitted, under sufficient pressure, that he felt something close to joy. He was not a man looking for trouble, but trouble, as it so often does in that country, came looking for him. It began on a Tuesday morning, as ordinary as any other in the Arizona spring. The sky was pale with early heat, the kind that arrived in April like a warning of what summer intended to do. Eli was mending a section of fence along the eastern boundary of his property when he heard it. The sound of hooves, frantic and uneven, followed by shouting. He straightened up slowly, shading his eyes against the white glare of the morning sun, and saw them coming fast across the open scrubland. 3 riders pushing hard, their horses kicking up a long red plume of dust behind them, and ahead of them, barely staying in the saddle of a small painted mare, was a boy. The boy couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He rode bareback, leaning low over the horse's neck, his dark hair whipping behind him in the hot wind. Apache. Eli could see that clearly enough. The way he rode, the way he moved with the animal rather than against it, the particular ease that comes from a childhood spent on horseback before a saddle ever enters the picture. The mare was a striking animal, white and brown with patches that looked almost deliberate, and one pale blue eye that caught the morning light like a piece of sky had gotten trapped inside her. She was fast, and she was frightened, and she was running with everything she had. The riders behind were gaining. One of them had a rope swinging in slow, practiced circles. They weren't trying to stop the boy. They were trying to take the horse. Eli Cord didn't deliberate. He set down his tools, stepped through the gap in the fence he had been repairing, and walked into the path of the oncoming riders with one hand raised and his voice cutting through the noise and the dust with the flat, absolute authority of a man who has spent years commanding cattle in open country and learned that the voice that carries is the one that doesn't rise. That's enough. The riders pulled up short, their horses stamping and blowing hard, throwing their heads against the sudden stop. 3 men. Eli recognized them all. Wade Pruitt, who ran the livery stable on the main street of Millhaven and had a reputation for knowing the value of every horse in the territory and caring about little else. His younger brother, Cole, who had his brother's appetite for advantage without any of the restraint that occasionally tempered Wade. And a drifter named Reese, who had been working odd jobs around Millhaven for the past month. A man with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to make himself useful to whoever was paying. Wade Pruitt's face was flushed and tight, with something balanced between fury and the particular embarrassment of a man who has been stopped publicly by someone he considers beneath him. "Stay out of this, Cord," he said. "That horse belongs to Frank Alderman. The boy stole it." Eli looked past him at the boy, who had brought the mare to a stop a few yards behind him and was watching with eyes that were steady and unafraid in a way that struck Eli deeply. Not the bravado of someone pretending not to be scared, but the genuine stillness of a child who has learned early that panic is a luxury and composure is survival. Eli spoke to him in the careful Apache he had picked up over years of trading along the river, enough to be understood if not elegant. The boy answered in English, slow and deliberate. "She is mine," he said. "My father bred her. She was taken from our camp 3 days ago." Wade Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're going to take an Apache's word over Frank Alderman's?" Eli turned back to the riders. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the rifle leaning against the fence post 6 feet to his left, though all 3 men were aware of it. "I'm going to find out the truth before anyone takes anything from anyone," he said. "You ride back to town, Wade. Tell Frank Alderman that if he has a claim on this animal, he can present it to the magistrate in Tucson like a man with nothing to hide." The silence that followed had weight and temperature, the way silences do in open country when something important is being decided. Cole Pruitt's hand drifted toward the rifle on his saddle with the slow, testing movement of a man who hasn't fully decided yet. Reese simply watched, his expression the flat patience of someone calculating odds. Wade stared at Eli for a long moment, measuring something. Then he wheeled his horse. "You're making a mistake," he said without turning back. They rode, and the dust they left behind settled slow and red in the morning air, and Eli Cord watched them go with the expression of a man who already knows the shape of what he has just set in motion. The boy's name was Nayland. He told Eli this while they stood at the well, and Eli drew water for the mare and looked her over with the careful eye of someone who has spent his adult life around horses and knows what honest ownership looks like on an animal. She was healthy and well kept, her coat clean, her hooves trimmed with care that spoke of regular attention rather than recent preparation. She was not the horse of a man who had recently acquired her. She was the horse of someone who had known her for years, and she showed it in the way she turned toward Naylin's voice without being called, in the way she accepted the boy's hand on her neck with the complete ease of long familiarity. There was a small brand on her left shoulder, faint but legible, that matched exactly the description Naylin gave of his father's mark. Eli believed him, not out of sentiment, and not because he had any particular reason to distrust Frank Alderman beyond instinct. He believed him because the evidence in front of him was plain, and Eli Cord had always found plain evidence more reliable than powerful men's assurances. He let Naylin stay the night. There was no dramatic decision in it. The boy was 12 years old, alone, and the men who had been chasing him were still somewhere between the ranch and Millhaven. Elena fed him without being asked, setting a plate in front of him with the matter-of-fact hospitality of a girl raised to treat guests as guests, regardless of who they were, and then sat across the table and asked him questions about the desert and the stars, and the horses of his people in the mixture of English and imperfect Apache that was her own version of her father's hard-earned vocabulary. Naylin answered her questions with the same steady composure he had shown all day, and somewhere in the middle of it he smiled once, briefly, at something Elena said, and the smile made him look exactly his age. Eli sat on the porch as the sun went down and watched the darkness come in from the east across the scrubland and felt the particular unease of a man who knows that what he has done is right and that being right does not protect you from consequence. If you're following this story, take a moment to leave your like. It helps bring more of these forgotten histories to the people who need to hear them. Frank Alderman was not a man who accepted contradiction quietly. He was the largest landowner in the Millhaven Valley, a figure of the particular frontier aristocracy that had grown up fast and hard in the territories. Men who had arrived early, accumulated aggressively, and over time had mistaken the absence of established law for a personal license to define it. He owned the bank where Eli's small operating loan was held. He had the ear of the territorial sheriff, a man named Briggs, who owed Alderman several favors of the kind that are never written down. He had agreements, understandings, and arrangements with half the businessmen in Millhaven that gave him a reach far wider than his property line suggested. And he wanted that horse. Not because the mare was especially valuable in purely financial terms, though she was a fine animal, but because Frank Alderman had decided she was his, and because a rancher of no particular standing had publicly told 3 of his men to ride back to town, and because Frank Alderman had not built what he had built by allowing that kind of thing to pass without answer. By Wednesday evening, the story moving through Millhaven had already become something different from what had actually happened, the way stories always do when they pass through enough mouths that want them to mean something specific. Eli Cord had drawn a gun on Wade Pruitt to protect a horse thief. Eli Cord was harboring an Apache fugitive on his land. Eli Cord had called Frank Alderman a liar in front of witnesses and dared him to do something about it. None of these things were precisely true. All of them were being repeated as established fact in the saloon, at the general store, and in the careful conversations that happen in small towns between men who are deciding which way the wind is blowing and where they want to be standing when it arrives. Eli heard the version that reached him from a supply driver who stopped at the ranch Thursday morning, and he listened without expression, thanked the man for the information, and went back to work. He was under no illusions about what was moving toward him. He had lived in the West long enough to understand how the machinery of a powerful man's displeasure operates, not through sudden dramatic confrontation, but through a series of quiet pressures applied at the points where a smaller man is most vulnerable. He had a loan. He had a property boundary that had been disputed twice before. He had a daughter who rode alone to town for supplies. He had 300 acres and a dream and no allies in Millhaven who could afford to stand beside him without risking the same pressure he was about to receive. He sent Naylin south before dawn on Thursday, giving the boy a cloth-wrapped bundle of food, a full canteen, and a folded piece of paper with careful writing on it. A brief account of what had happened, the date, the names, the facts as Eli knew them, addressed to no one in particular, simply a record that existed outside of his own memory. "If anyone stops you," Eli told him quietly in the gray pre-dawn, "show them that paper. And if they don't care about the paper, you ride and you don't stop." Naylin looked at him for a moment with those measuring eyes. "Why do you help me?" the boy asked. The question was direct and genuine, without any of the rhetorical weight an adult might put into it. Eli considered it honestly. "Because no one should lose what's theirs," he said finally, "just because someone bigger wants it." Naylin nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he and the mare moved south into the darkness, and the desert swallowed them both. Sheriff Briggs arrived at the Cord Ranch on Friday morning with 2 deputies and a document bearing Frank Alderman's signature, claiming the painted mare as property stolen from his stock and demanding her surrender along with the Apache boy for questioning. Briggs was not a cruel man, just a practical one, which in certain situations is considerably worse than cruelty because practical men give their compromises sensible names and sleep without difficulty. He laid out the situation to Eli in the flat, measured tone of someone delivering a business transaction rather than a moral choice. Eli told him, with equal politeness, that the horse and the boy were gone, that he had no knowledge of their current whereabouts, and that if Mr. Alderman wished to pursue his claim on the animal, he was entirely welcome to present his evidence to a federal magistrate in Tucson, where it could be examined properly. Briggs looked at him for a long moment with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity, or possibly both in the proportion that honest men feel when they watch another honest man walk willingly into something hard. "You know what this is going to cost you, Eli," he said, low enough that the deputies couldn't hear. "I know," Eli said. "Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting to be told." The cost came in pieces, the way serious damage usually does. Not in one catastrophic moment, but in a series of quiet, grinding pressures that arrive close together so that you are always absorbing the last blow when the next one lands. Frank Alderman called in the note on Eli's operating loan the following week, citing a technical clause buried in the original agreement that allowed for early collection under conditions that had never previously been invoked, and that Eli's original attorney, a man in Tucson who had since retired, had apparently not considered worth explaining in detail. Eli had 60 days to produce the full outstanding amount or forfeit the property as collateral. He rode to Tucson to seek legal counsel and spent 2 days working through the available options, finding that the 2 attorneys who regularly handled territorial property disputes had both recently entered into professional relationships with Frank Alderman in other matters and could not take his case. The third attorney in town was a young man from Ohio named Patterson, who had been in the territory less than a year, who listened to everything Eli said with careful attention, asked precise questions, made thorough notes, and then told him honestly that the case had genuine merit. But that merit and outcome were not the same thing in a territory where one man had the financial resources to sustain litigation for years and the other did not. Elena watched all of this with the particular helpless alertness of someone who is almost old enough to act, and not quite old enough to know how. She had her mother's eyes, dark and direct, and her father's quality of stillness under pressure, that ability to continue functioning at full capacity while something difficult was happening, as though the difficult thing was simply another condition of the environment to be accounted for rather than a crisis-demanding reaction. She was not passive, though. She wrote letters to the territorial newspaper in Tucson describing what had happened, in plain and careful language signed with her full name. She rode to 3 neighboring ranches and spoke to the men there about what she knew and what she suspected, not asking for anything directly, but planting the kind of questions that stay with people. She asked her father for the names of anyone who might have had similar experiences with Frank Alderman, and then wrote to 2 of those men without telling Eli, because she knew he would tell her it wasn't her business, and she had already decided it was. Eli found out about the letters eventually, and said only that the second paragraph needed better grammar, which was his way of telling her he thought she had done right. What neither of them knew was that Elena's letters were landing on a desk that had been waiting for exactly this kind of material for 2 years. Thomas Marsh was a correspondent for the Arizona Weekly Citizen who had been quietly and methodically tracking the expansion of Frank Alderman's land holdings since 1881. He had spoken to 4 small ranchers who had lost property through financial pressure following disagreements with Alderman. He had spoken to Apache and Mexican traders who described stock disappearing from their camps and reappearing in Alderman's corrals. He had documents, dates, names, and a pattern that was unmistakable to anyone willing to look at it directly. What he had lacked was a current, documented incident with living witnesses and a clear narrative line. He read Elena's letter on a Wednesday morning in his office in Tucson, and by Thursday afternoon he was on a horse riding toward Millhaven. He arrived on a Sunday, riding a rented horse and carrying a leather satchel dense with organized notes. He went to the sheriff's office first, then to the bank, then out along the river road to the Cord Ranch. Eli met him at the gate with the frank suspicion of a man who has recently accumulated good reasons not to trust the arrival of strangers. But Thomas Marsh understood that the fastest path to a cautious man's trust was to already know the facts before asking the questions. He spread what he had across Eli's kitchen table: documents, sworn statements, property records, dates aligned in a column that told a story with the cold clarity of arithmetic. Eli studied them for a long time without speaking. Elena stood in the doorway to the kitchen and read everything upside down and said nothing. "Why come to me?" Eli asked finally. Marsh tapped Elena's letter where it sat at the edge of the table. "Because whoever raised her probably thinks the same way she does," he said, "and I needed someone in the middle of this who wouldn't disappear before the story was finished." Eli looked at him for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was just a fact, stated with the same tone a man uses to describe the weather. The story Thomas Marsh published in the Arizona Weekly Citizen on the 14th of May, 1883, ran across 3 full columns under a headline that named Alderman directly, and used the word reckoning without apology. It named names. It cited documents. It quoted the displaced ranchers, the Apache and Mexican traders, and one 16-year-old girl from a ranch south of the Gila River who expressed herself in print with a precision that made several of Marsh's colleagues uncomfortable in the way that plain truth spoken without deference tends to make comfortable people uncomfortable. Alderman's attorneys filed for an injunction against the paper within 48 hours. The injunction was denied. The story was already moving east by telegraph, picked up by papers in Santa Fe and Denver, and within a week a summary had appeared in a St. Louis publication that reached Washington. What followed was not fast, and it was not clean. The federal marshal's office in Tucson opened an investigation. Not because justice was swift in the Arizona Territory in 1883, but because Frank Alderman had accumulated enemies of his own within the territorial government, men who had been waiting for an opening that was too documented and too public to be quietly managed. The investigation moved with the deliberate pace of frontier bureaucracy, collecting depositions and examining property records and interviewing witnesses over the course of months. Alderman's attorneys challenged every step, but the documents were real, the witnesses were credible, and Thomas Marsh kept writing, following every development with the patient consistency of a man who has decided that a story is worth the full length of time it takes to tell it properly. Eli Cord did not emerge from it whole. He spent the following months in a legal fight that cost him the eastern quarter of his property, the river-adjacent section, the best grazing land, the piece he had been most proud of because it was the piece that had been hardest to acquire. He signed the transfer papers in a Tucson office on a September morning with the expression of a man who has done the full arithmetic and accepted the answer without pretending it doesn't hurt. He had kept the house, he had kept the well, he had kept the harder, drier western land, the 300 acres of caliche and juniper and dust that had been the original dream before the river section came along and made it something more. It wasn't everything, but it was his and it was real, and he had not obtained it by looking away from something wrong. Frank Alderman was never imprisoned. Men of his position in that era, as in most eras, found ways to absorb legal consequences that would have destroyed smaller men, converting criminal exposure into civil settlements, regulatory findings into negotiated outcomes, public disgrace into a quieter kind of diminishment that still left them standing. But the federal investigation resulted in the return of 3 parcels of land to the ranchers from whom they had been taken through legally questionable financial pressure. Sheriff Briggs resigned his position in October and moved to California, where he apparently spent the rest of his years in a coastal town doing something entirely unrelated to law enforcement. 2 of the displaced ranchers came back to portions of their original properties. The machinery of Alderman's influence was not destroyed, but it was damaged in a way that made it work with less smoothness and less certainty for the remainder of his years in the territory, which is sometimes the most that can be asked of a reckoning. Nalin reached his family's camp without incident. His father, a man named Goso, who had a reputation among the river traders as a person of absolute and quiet integrity, sent a message north through the trading network in June. It arrived at the Cord Ranch, carried by a trader who said only that it came from a man who wanted to say something and didn't have many words for it. The message was 3 words in Apache, translated carefully by the trader with the slightly self-conscious precision of someone conveying something they sense is important. He sees you. Eli read it twice, standing in the yard in the afternoon light. He folded it carefully and put it in the cedar box where he kept Ruth's letters, and the few other things in his life that he considered worth preserving. Comment below. Would you have done what Eli did? Would you have stepped into that path knowing the full weight of what it would cost? There are no wrong answers here, only honest ones. The painted mare was seen occasionally in the years that followed, moving through the scrubland south of the Gila with the ease of an animal that knows exactly where it belongs. Travelers on the southern trails described her. A white and brown horse with one pale blue eye, visible sometimes at dawn on the far side of a dry creek bed, gone before you were sure you had actually seen her. Some people said Nalene rode her until he was a young man. Some said she eventually ran free, one of those horses the desert reclaims the way it reclaims everything eventually. Slowly, completely, without apology or explanation. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with speeches or with the dramatic staging that stories tend to give to brave moments when they are retold. It shows up on an ordinary Tuesday morning, squinting into the Arizona glare, and simply declines to move out of the way of something wrong. Eli Cord was not a hero in the elevated sense that word is usually meant. He was a man who lost something real and concrete because he chose to do something right in a moment when doing nothing would have cost him far less. He knew the cost going in, not the exact amount, but the general shape of it. He paid it without theater, without self-pity, and without revising his understanding of whether it had been worth it. Because for a man built the way he was built, that question simply didn't have the relevance it might have had for someone else. The West was full of men who wore the vocabulary of honor and justice the way they wore their Sunday clothes. Taken out for occasions, carefully maintained, put away again when the day was done. Eli Cord wore those things the way he wore his work clothes, without thinking about it, because they were simply what you put on when you had somewhere to be and something to do, and the morning was already burning, and the fence wasn't going to mend itself. If this story stayed with you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. Would you have made the same choice? The Old West was full of moments like this one, moments where an ordinary person had to decide who they actually were when it mattered. We'll be back with more of those stories, the ones the history books almost forgot to keep.